Welcome. Thank you very much. It's a little sad, of course, this year that we're not all in The Hague for an actual ImpactFest. This is an alternative version. I've been there the last 2 years, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of really cool people. We're doing it this way. I'll be speaking for about 15 minutes. Let's see, can I scroll through my slides? There we go. Quick intro, 15 minutes to kind of 15, 20 minutes to lay the land, and then we'll talk to Frederick and Rasmus. We'll introduce you in a second, guys. So a quick word about Rainmaking, just so you know who's speaking. I'm a partner and co-founder. I also co-founded Startup Bootcamp. And we are a partnership of serial entrepreneurs, and we work, our mission is to unleash the power of entrepreneurship to solve big problems. So both with big and small companies. This is part of a series of webinars we've done on the back of releasing what we're calling the SDG Compass. We're going to share the link if you want to check it out. This basically was an effort at putting our arms around over 2,000 startups, what we call impact startups, and mapping them across the 17 SDGs. And then we've been doing some deep dives on certain SDGs, for example, 7, affordable and clean energy. And on the back of that, we've done this extra webinar because we very quickly figured out that, and this is not news to most of you, but impact measurement is a huge issue. And I'll be honest with you, this could easily be a 4-week online course. Not that I'd be ready to teach it, but it is a very complex and thorny issue. And this is almost, we're flying at 10,000 feet here. There's much more detail to get into. But the reason of bringing Frederick and Rasmus is, we have some practitioners, or at least users or developers of measurement, and I think it'll be interesting to hear from them. So super quickly, Frederick, if you can unmute and just a 30-second intro on yourself and TrueFootprint.
Sure, with pleasure. So Frederick Galtung, I had a Cambridge, UK-based technology company called TrueFootprint. And I come with a background actually from the social and development sector. I'm a social entrepreneur, so not far removed from Erasmus, having worked on transparency and accountability issues. And with my 2 co-founders, what we're doing with TrueFootprint is seeking to address that challenge of the quality of impact and sustainability data, both for the financial industry and for corporates and through their supply chain.
Awesome. Thank you, Frederick. And Rasmus, can you explain what CARE is and global focus?
Sure. So I'm Rasmus Sture Jacobsen. I'm the director of CARE. CARE is an international NGO. If you're not familiar with us, you might know of Save the Children or Oxfam or Red Cross and so on. So we are sort of in that group of organizations, and CARE is a major international player. We are sort of top 5 in the world. So we work in more than 100 countries around the world, the poorest and most fragile countries. And of course, it's and this is all I've been doing for the last 20 years, working sort of in the development and humanitarian space. And of course, our customers, our end users are the beneficiaries, the project participants that we are here to serve and work with. And of course, hence, it's just super important that we also know how to qualify and measure the impact of what we do. That is sort of our entire sort of reason for being. On top, I'm also the chairman of the civil society network in Denmark called Global Focus.
Awesome, thank you. I have many, many questions for both of you, so I'm really looking forward to speaking with both of you. So now let's go back to the 10,000-foot view of impact measurement. So why do we measure impact? It's pretty obvious, but I will admit I was trying to get a corporate to join the webinar. Everybody's busy. I'm sort of representing the corporate side, and in fact, Rainmaking works with very large companies, so this is close to my heart. And why is that important? It's because, as it says in the subtitle there, companies represent, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the economic weight of the entire activity on the planet. So in a way, they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest lever we have in fixing our big problems. And so, working with them on innovation and impact measurement is obviously super important to our mission. There are other reasons. So why would corporates, and others, but why would corporates, measure change? Obviously, we have a burning issue with climate change, and that's sort of, as Frederick called it, the elephant in the room. Another big reason, and it often starts with the money, unfortunately, is if you're familiar with ESG, environment, social governance, this is a sort of 3 buckets of measurements that investors are focusing on when they go green, or whatever you call it, sustainable investment, divesting, etc. And there's now, by some estimates, $21 trillion of ESG investment that is looking for places to go, and that is being more discriminatory about, not just divesting and doing no harm, but actually doing good. And so companies, if they want to raise money and have their share prices be stable, they need to be ESG positive, if you will. Regulators, the EU is coming out. Countries in Denmark, we have, there are rules about CSR reporting that have to accompany annual reports. Obviously, if companies are driving their sustainability efforts, they have to be able to measure the impact of what they're doing. Customers and talent retention is, almost no one wants to work for old school companies that don't have ESG or sustainability on their radar. And then, of course, we've had CSR and sustainability inside companies for a while, and that's been existing, but I think that can be enhanced. This is just a sample of the top energy companies in Europe. By our estimates or investigation, all of them have announced net zero emission targets by 2050. And you see some of them have announced sort of intermediary targets, ranging from 15 to 40 in 10 years, 35 to 70 in 20 years, but they're all going there. So the good thing is it's not only the external pressures, or maybe this is in response to external pressures, but they're basically defining their own targets, and that means they also need to measure their progress, and they can't do that with the regular P&L and balance sheet. Just to take an example, Vattenfall, energy company in Sweden, has declared this target of becoming fossil free within 1 generation. This graph on the right is their CO2 emissions in million tons per annum. And you see they started 0 in 1990, where they were 50% nuclear and 50% hydro. And then they had some acquisitions in Poland, Germany, and Netherlands. And then obviously they didn't acquire energy businesses that were as clean. They divested from one company in Germany. And then now, the gap to reaching the net zero is essentially an innovation gap. And so you kind of see the story there of investing, divesting, and now what's left? Well, the gap is innovation. So innovation is essential to get to the targets, whether we talk about UN SDGs or their own targets. It's absolutely essential. And impact measurement is basically a requirement to know how we're doing. So super basic, again, staying at the 10,000 foot view is, what are the essentials? And again, I'm talking with sort of the lenses of corporate, but whatever impact measurement framework or capability, it has to be workable in the real world. So, there's some fantastic intellectual framework, conceptual, but, they have to work in the context of a large company. Granularity is a huge issue. Some metrics and frameworks are super niche about a single topic in the supply chain on the use of, one resource. Versus being way too high level and basically I don't know what to change. So the right level of detail to track change is super important. It has to roll up into whatever aggregate numbers you're tracking, ESG, your own CSR reporting. And then there's maybe softer, but just being aligned with company culture, strategy, objectives. Not everything fits for everyone. And then this is where we can get maybe a little bit more conceptual, and there's more to talk about here, but basically, there's at least four elements to think of. As materiality, as you measuring what matters. Intentionality is, did you mean to impact what you did, or what if you had done nothing? Would you have gotten the same result? Additionality has to do with, what if you had done things differently, or if, if you had done things differently, would you have had the same outcome? And then causation is actually the hard part. Basically a difference between correlation and causation. That's probably the holy grail, and we can come back and see if maybe Frederick, have you cracked it, or Rasmus, how do you actually prove that a measure changed because of something you did? That's not trivial. So in terms of the landscape, and this is where, within a couple of weeks of saying we'll do this webinar, we were like, holy smokes, what have we taken on? This is a jungle. It's very complex. The thing to remember, and Sir Richard Cohen makes a good point, is that, when it comes to gap, in the financial, generally accepted accounting practices, or the Financial Accounting Standards Board for publicly traded companies, this stuff has been under development for 80 plus 90 years, and really we're kind of 10, 20 years into this. So in a way we feel impatient and confused, but it's early days and it's complex, and we will get there. But let's not forget that we're early in the journey. This is a slide inspired by a slide, a little PDF that a company called Greenstone put out. You can see the source there in the bottom, which kind of illustrates this jungle, if you will. So if I start top right, there are principles and protocols. So of course, the Sustainable Development Goals come with their own targets. The UN Global Compact, if you're a member, you have to report. It's pretty high level reporting. There are others. You have the frameworks. If you're new to this, SASB, so this is the equivalent of the Financial Accounting Standards Board's Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And they've got some good work in mapping this to other frameworks, and it's worth reading about. The GRI, CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, TCFD, but I mean, you can just deep dive into one of these, get very good, and there are others. When it comes to indices and ratings, this is where the big financial investors, mostly ESG, Sustainalytics is one company. There are others that are basically, publish ESG scores. The issue is the same company can get a different ESG score from a different company, from a different assessor, if you will. And then there's obviously legislation and regulation, which is going to add another layer of complexity. So it's not easy if to meet the criteria I discussed above if you're in the middle of the jungle. So a super quick pause, a quick poll for you to tell us what you think the issues are with impact measurement, and then we'll compare to what companies are actually saying. So if you can just pick on one of these. Is it deciding what to measure? Is it collecting data? Is it understanding the data? Or is it actually using the data for decision making? I'm not even allowed to vote. That's not fair. We'll just give it 10 seconds, and then we'll click and look at the results. We'll see what this audience thinks, and then we'll see if that aligns with what companies are saying. So we see the result. Coming. Some computer somewhere is working. There's a chat window. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom. Start putting in your questions for Frederick, Rasmus. We'll be collecting the good ones and getting to them. Is it coming? Oh, I don't see the result. Okay. Do you see the result?
No, but we have deciding what to measure 65%, collecting data 15%, understanding data 4%.
Okay, so most of you think it's about deciding what to measure. Okay, interesting. All right, let's see. So just something I could have put earlier, but basically it's important to think about what is impact. There's an OECD definition there at the top. We just walk through a very simple example, and maybe this is close to something where like an NGO like CARE would do. Is there's an input of $100,000 for agricultural training. The output is training given to farmers. The outcome, oh, now I see the results. The outcome is farmers are applying that knowledge and their crop yield going up. And the impact is farmers are better off, the quality of product increases, no child labor, etc. So very strong distinction when it comes to impact measurement on input, output, outcomes, and impact. And in fact, the GIN polled 169 companies, or surveyed the reports from 169 companies, and only 62 of those 169 said they were actually able to measure impact. So they're measuring other things. They can say, you know, we put in 100,000, or we trained 10,000 farmers, or maybe the farmers applied, but we don't really know the impact. And that is the crux of our problem here. Now, a lot of them are measuring outputs, as you can see. And by the way, this can be double counted. You can be doing multiple things. And many are measuring outcomes, but there's just way too few are measuring impact. And this is where we need to go. And when it comes to asking them what they thought their issues was, is collecting data. That's number one. And the other one is aggregating and analyzing and interpreting. And by the way, I'll give you my mail, and you can get these slides and the sources if you want at the end. Just a summary before we start talking to Frederick and Asmus is, what's wrong today is, I just illustrated that one, is we're measuring a lot of activity and output. We're not measuring impact. The frameworks are all over the place, indices, approaches, etc. There's a lack of transparency. Frederick will talk about that, but basically, when it comes to supply chain impact, 60 to 70% of that impact happens at the beginning of the supply chain. So you can be measuring things at the end, but if you don't have the beginning, you're missing a big picture. And then the ESG scores, as I mentioned, are all over the place, and there are many other problems. So we have both a huge necessity to get this right. We have a lot of attempts, a lot of valiant attempts on making it right, but it's all over the place. So in terms of who's working on solutions, so we have Frederick from TrueFootprint. We'll talk about ESG and also what I'm calling, for lack of a better word, bottom up, but at the source measuring of impact. I think that's a very interesting approach. I'm keen to hear more. So there's a sort of a measurement approach on the ground, and then there's the super niche, 120 water, which is we're going to tackle the water compliance management. So that's fine, but if you're a company and you have many types of resources, do you go to everyone who's best in that niche? But then how do you aggregate up? And then you have the more sort of tech, AI, machine learning, an Upright project, startup out of Finland doing interesting things, and basically using the power of machine learning and AI to interpret a gazillion data points about everything, trying to aggregate the world into different impacts by company, where you get an impact by company based on raw materials and lots of other things. So there are lots and lots of, and I'm sure we could find dozens and dozens of startups and initiatives. But again, where do you begin if you're a company? I do want to mention in closing, we're impressed with the effort with the Harvard Business School, and actually Sir Richard Cohen I mentioned earlier is also behind this impact weighted account. So here, the idea is when you look at the EBIT result of a company, let's say it's a chocolate maker from Switzerland or whatever, and they say, our EBIT is 2 billion for the year, there is actually a method to get the actual cost and impact of everything they do, so that if their environment is actually costing -5 billion, then their net result is closer to -3. And so you get a more balanced view, and then there's a bunch of methodology on how they do that, and it's probably worth its own webinar. But it's trying to say, we've been reporting P&Ls and balance sheets for many, many decades. How do we get that so that there's an actual bottom line that is fully aggregated? And there have been other attempts at this. It's worth reading about. I will put this in we have reading list, and there's much, much more to read if you ask for the slides. You can get those. And my email is here, af@rainmaking.io. Cool. So I shall stop sharing, and I hope everybody can see the speakers now. So Rasmus, I'm gonna start with a hard question. You're in so many countries and probably doing more than one project. How do you aggregate your impact? How do you know you did better this year than last year?
That is a really tough question.
I told you.
Yes, yes, and if there's something that we spend a lot of time and resources on, it's exactly that. On top, sort of adding to the complexity, we are sort of a family, a family of NGOs within CARE. So France might have a slightly different take than we have, and somehow we need to gather data and generate data that we can compare across different organizations at a global level. I think what we are doing at current, and we are by no means there yet, but we are currently trying to do something that we call outcome harvesting. Mm-hmm. And that's an approach where we try, sort of compared to the slide that you showed, Alex, sort of from OECD, which is based on sort of a logical sequencing of if we input A, that will, and we undertake certain activities, that will lead to a certain output, which will generate an outcome, and then hence we have impact.
Yeah.
What we are finding ourselves, what we have been doing in sort of measuring that is that we somehow get too boxed into sort of, did we do the activity right? Did we actually sort of did we do those 5 or 6 trainings in Kenya or whatnot?
Right.
And we spend the energy there rather than sort of looking at what were then the impacts of all of that subsequently. Now we are trying to somehow turn it upside down, saying, let's look at the change that happened. What change happened in this context? And start from the top, and then see if we can roll that back down and say, and then subsequently ask the question, and so what was our contribution to that? And was it potentially a significant contribution or an insignificant contribution?
Right.
It adds, it forces us to sort of look at the impact first, and then subsequently sort of our own actions rather than the other way around. But it doesn't really help us, to be honest. It doesn't really help us in measuring across.
So
there.
So I understand the intention. How do you do it practically? How do you measure that change you mentioned?
Yeah, practically we do have some tools, and I'm very happy to share those with you, Alex, and then you can distribute wider. It does tend still, I think, to become sort of a little bit too complex. But of course, we have to somehow sit in. It's all about sort of groups of people who've been part of that change process. It's a lot about sort of qualitative input into that, where we get really precise on what were our exact contributions, and then sort of amongst those who participated in that change process, trying to sort of figure out what mattered most and what mattered less somehow. And we are not fully there. We are trying sort of to develop. It's still sort of work in progress, but we think that there's something very important in sort of making that, in trying to turn it upside down somehow.
Exactly. So Frederick, tell us. I think you're trying to address exactly this problem. So tell us what you think is wrong today and why you built TrueFootprint, and what is your approach on this beginning of the supply chain issue?
So I want to pick up a couple of things from your presentation, Alex. That was very helpful, and thanks for that overview. One is that distinction on what is material, and then the input, output, outcome, and impact debate, which is very familiar to people who work in development, but is not often a distinction made neatly enough in the corporate sector. Some are definitely attuned to it, but many are not. So just as one example, a very common reference point when talking about doing something for climate change is planting trees, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you've planted 100,000 trees, well, it sounds, first of all, like a fabulous commitment. But is that an input, an output, an outcome, or an impact? Right?
Well, it's not impact yet.
It's certainly not impact yet, right? And so it's actually an output. Because if you plant those trees anywhere in the world, a certain number of them are going to die from disease. Some of them are going to die from lack of water. And if you plant those trees in Africa, poor things, goats love young trees. And so goats are going to eat a significant portion of them. And so if you don't have a strategy for how to deal with goats, basically a very good portion of your trees are going to be goat feed. So it's like saying, I want to reduce teenage pregnancy and I'm distributing 100,000 condoms, because we know that condoms, can contribute to that. But if you don't know if that they're being used properly, your distribution of those condoms, could be used for entertainment, could be used for water balloons, it could be used for lots of things, except for the intended purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So it's always that challenge of using a proxy of clean cook stoves, of gas lights, of lots of things that look very good, but if they're not actually being used in the way they were intended or supposed to be, they're not going to achieve that impact. And actually, yes, impact measurement is the holy grail. It's what we really want. But there is a prior step to that, which is outcome data. And outcome data has a fabulous purpose. And so we are here a couple of Scandinavians, but so there is a Scandinavian from that other country, Sweden, right? The wonderful Hans Rosling, right? Yeah. Who wrote Factfulness. And if anyone hasn't watched his TED Talks, they were fabulous. He unfortunately passed away too young a few years ago. But he also is a fan of outcome data, right? So it's not just me, it's certainly him as well. And the beauty of outcome data is that it's about efficiency and effectiveness. It allows us to benchmark performance. Because if you're a very large company, your impact is going to be larger than a small company, right? Your positive or negative impact. But what I do want to know, so it's not that that impact isn't important, but I also want to know your efficiency and your effectiveness. And that's where the outcome data comes in, right? And so when we looked, for example, at the mining industry, and you can look at our sector reports, we found that 70% of non-financial reporting in the mining industry were input and output data points, KPIs. So their intentionality was being reported. Mm-hmm. Now, parallel in the development sector is to say we touch 10,000 girls, right? We train 5,000 or 5 million farmers, etc. That's still output data. Mm-hmm. And then 26% was outcome data, only 4% in this case was impact data. So your table, your graph is a bit misleading because the fact that they report any impact data, right, sounds good, but if it's only 4% of their total KPIs, it's less good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is their additionality, right? So the intentionality, that's the inputs and outputs. The additionality, that's the outcomes and impact.
Right.
And if they're not able to report their additionality across many key dimensions, it means basically either they don't know themselves, they're certainly not reporting to the world whether their investment is making any difference. And that's a problem.
So what are you doing with TrueFootprint? Tell us how you're tackling this.
So we focus on the production of far better outcome data.
Yeah.
As the first step to move us towards impact. But we can't bypass that step. Mm-hmm. And right now, as I said, the industry is not producing quality outcome data at all. In fact, the EU directives until recently were all about output commitments. The UN Global Compact is all outputs. Do you have a policy on this? A policy is an output. It's not an outcome or an impact. Now, the first thing we do is that. The second thing we do is the critical thing, which is capturing it. You mentioned this briefly, is at the base of the supply chain. So farming, for example, agroforestry, fishery, and mining. That's the bottom. You can't go further down than that. But it happens to be that across product categories, so the laptop we work from, the coffee we drink, the clothes we wear, it's between 70 to 90% of the negative externalities are produced at the bottom of those supply chains. Yeah. And that includes dairy farming in Denmark. It doesn't matter where the bottom is. Wherever the bottom is where you're generating most of those negative externalities.
The bottom or the start.
Negative externalities may vary. Now, here's our proposition. So the first observation is very straightforward. If we're serious about the climate transition, we have to be serious about the bottom of the supply chain. Not because we morally owe them something and want, in the old days, it was because we felt poverty was a bad thing. We should be concerned about that. but because that is where the negative effect is. In coffee, it's over 90%. So if you're serious about climate change, no point having a beautiful carbon neutral factory. You have to be thinking about the bottom of the supply chain. The current way data is collected from the bottom is top down today. It is people sending out surveys, sending out inspectors, sending out evaluators. It's all top down. Now, if you want people to be responsible for that change, to take ownership of that change, they need to produce their own data. You need to have verifiable ways in which they produce their own data so that they can say, Care, you did a really good job this year. Last year, you were even better. And by the way, when I compare you to Oxfam, to the Ministry of Education, and to WHO, here's what I found. That would be community-centered data production, right? What the different NGOs do today is they each have their own reporting, but they don't have a way for the community to report on each donor, each organization, including the Ministry of Health, separately themselves. Now, this is what needs to happen at the base of supply chains, right? So the equivalent today for what we have is you're running a small business. You're not allowed to produce your own financial statement. Someone else comes around once a year, maybe every 18 months, and tells you how much money you made. They don't tell you how it's calculated. They give you a score, a certificate, maybe, right? And that's what happens around ethical sourcing, around sustainable production today. The farmers, the producers, the mining companies don't generate their own financial or their own impact statements.
But we've established the problem, I think, really, really well. So how are you going about tackling this?
So this builds the methodology and technology, because it's not just a technology that makes it possible, but builds on 10 years of prior work actually in the development sector. And working at the community level to have people be able to monitor thousands of projects worth over $1 billion, $1.2 billion in 14 countries, and care projects were among them, right? And now we've applied this, and this is the original element here is the following. If you ask people to self-report, do I employ children illegally? Do I use banned pesticides? Those are not very useful data points, right? And even reporting on their neighbor, again, not a helpful data point. This is also not about satisfaction, right? Which is what a very common survey is. Were you satisfied with the survey we gave you? It's not a helpful data point either. If someone is extremely vulnerable, you can't work with it. So what we developed is a methodology for people to ascertain, to check whether projects and services and standards are compliant with the norms. And are they able to problem solve in relation to those discrepancies? So is a public road built properly? Is a project that was meant to benefit them by an NGO, is it being delivered properly? And when it's not delivered properly, are they able to contribute to solving it themselves? Because that's when they take ownership of it. And so what we're generating here is data that is validating projects bottom up on anyone who is working in their community. And we're getting data as the byproduct of people solving those problems and getting data generated on a continuous basis. It gives us validated output data, outcome data, and eventually impact data.
And how do you do that? How do you collect the data?
It's the people in the community generating their own findings. And so right now we're running a very big project on COVID-19. So it's capturing data on whether health facilities are safe. Are they compliant with the World Health Organization guidance on what constitutes a basic safe healthcare provision? And what we have done is the same logic, is empowering healthcare workers and patients, especially patients with chronic conditions, to report on this. And within 6 weeks, we had partners in over 50 countries because they are desperately anxious about the state of affairs. So they're reporting on this discrepancy, and where they're finding a lot of discrepancy, but then the most important thing is the extent to which they are problem solving and crowdsourcing the learning of how problems are being solved. And we're just in the early stages of that. So we have run through pilots in 23 countries with 8 ministries of health interested to work with us on this. But we are not the service provider, right? This is simply empowering these voices from below.
Awesome. So that makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, can I comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to bring you in, Rasmus. So if you can react to that, and also I see you shared the outcome harvesting.
Yes, I did. So there's a couple of I hope useful links there, and I think I mean what I take away from hearing you speak, Frederick, it resembles somehow what we are trying to do with the outcome harvesting. It's putting the focus on that level and sort of looking at what actually happened. What happened as the point of departure, and then sort of rolling that back in terms of figuring out our own role in that project. But I think, Frederick, you're touching on really important points, and I think also the way that you explain what sort of your recent project and how big it is and how complex it is and so on. And I think sometimes it's a little bit of a separate point, but this takes resources. It takes energy. It takes time. But I think looking at the development sector, at least, if we compare the level of resources that we put into this sort of the outcome harvesting and measuring our impact, compared to the resources that we put into reporting back upwards to our donors and sponsors and funders and so on, it's nothing. I mean, it's uncomparable. We're spending far more energy in the upwards reporting than we do sort of in the downward or bottom-up outcome harvesting. And I think, I mean, we need to become aware of that. And I think, and for us now in Care Denmark, we are sort of setting an aim and saying that needs to be an equal balance. I mean, why on earth should there be sort of an imbalance there? And why do our donors require more attention than, and so on? And essentially, it has to do with the quality of what we are able to deliver, of course. And I think for Care, and quite honestly, I mean, we just went through sort of an external audit up against what we in the business call the core humanitarian standards. Mm-hmm. I'm not going into detail with that, but I think, Frederick, you are talking a little bit about something similar, saying, I mean, if you deliver towards sort of the best practices and you're constantly sort of in a process of improving how you do business, then your attribution, I mean, essentially, you simply become a more transparent and a more accountable operator. And where we have weak points, not only as Care Denmark, but as a sector, is exactly in the dialogue with our end user. It's always like that. It's of course always also extremely complicated. We are in difficult contexts, lack of network and so on, and people that can't read or write in some context and so on. So it's not easy to sort of go out and generate. But regardless, and across the board, this is sort of time and again coming out as a weakness. And looking at the private sector or startup, that would sort of resemble that you are a little bit out of touch with your customer. Mm-hmm. And what would happen to your project or sort of product if you were if you didn't have a pretty good sort of feedback loop with your customers? Well, you would become irrelevant and you would deliver poor quality. So anyway, so it was somehow, Frederick, taking a few of your points and also I think sort of recognizing, and I'm not sure if this is the same sort of in the corporate sector, but it might be that there is that imbalance on where you put your time and energy.
Yeah, I mean, what we saw it in the survey. I mean, they're basically, only 62 out of the 169 are self-declaring, at least, that they're putting, reporting on actual impact. And it doesn't ask why are you not, but I assume it's because it's incredibly difficult. Frederick, there was a question from Wilhelmien about what about long-term effects and impact? What is there a sweet spot in time where you're more accurate, or what about the long term? Because obviously some of these things take a long time to even have impact.
Well, you're absolutely right, and this is a key point. And look, the truth is that even though I did this in my past work, and now, of course, at this considerable scale, we have not ourselves been able to do this on longer term in the ways that we would like to. And partly this is why we set up TrueFootprint, was exactly to do that, because the international aid, including government services in many countries, it's project by project, budget by budget cycle. But when it comes to international supply chains, first, they are a magnitude larger, even excluding oil and gas. We're talking about commodities from the global south that are around 5 to 7 times bigger than all of international development. But it's not as stochastic, right? It is, you know, when you have a farming area, they are, yes, prices will fluctuate, but they will be doing this year after year. And so there's far more continuity in terms of the relationships. And so thanks for the question. This is very much the aim. But also a huge thanks to you, Rasmus, for your engagement with this, because you know, maybe something that comes out of our panel here is that we try to do something together. But look, this is an enormous challenge. And if I share, you know, a conversation with the head of audit, deputy head of audit of a very large NGO, he said, you know, we've introduced a new financial management system. We work in multiple countries. If you ask me how much money we have spent building new toilets in the last year and refurbishing them, I can tell you at the press of a button. But if you ask me how many toilets were actually built, I have no idea. And if you ask me how many of them are still functioning a year later, I haven't a clue. If we were a company, it's the equivalent of a major hotel chain saying, I know how much money we spent building new hotels last year. No. I have no idea where they are, right? And I can't tell you if they're still operating a year later. Now that, as you said, Rasmus, is a missing feedback loop, right? There's a very basic element missing. And unfortunately, that large organization has not been able to change it. There are many people within it very frustrated by that reality, but that is unfortunately the case.
Do you, either of you, think technology has a role to play? Have you seen, you know, Rasmus, has someone come knocking on your door and said, you know, I have the blockchain solution to tracking everything? Or do you think, you know, it's always going to be more human centric, and you know, we can't, or maybe it's a combination? But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think perhaps a combination, but I think definitely technology is going to help us here. Clearly, when we sort of get out there, far out in the countryside in Chad or South Sudan or wherever, most people would be unfamiliar with sort of fairly modern technology. But that doesn't mean that they can't be taught. And the instruments are fairly simple. It holds some, I think, really interesting perspectives in terms of sort of strengthening and building in that feedback loop. We sort of been trying out and testing out both qualitative measures in terms of sort of video documentation and photo images and so on, and then sort of gone back and interviewed people on what they've been documenting and what documented and why they did it, and sort of explaining the stories, to, you know, punching in numbers or punching in sort of whenever this occurred and this occurred and this occurred, and then sort of the more quantitative data. And I think that I mean, coming real quick, there are some great opportunities there, no doubt about it.
What about you, Frederick? I know your you know, mobile phones are involved in at least one of your solutions as a data gathering, but is that the key, or is it the fact that you're just asking the question and it doesn't matter how it's collected, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, our bottom-up solution is definitely powered by basic smartphones, that's for sure, and you know, the widespread use of them, it's, you know, there are more than 1 billion of them in the global south already. There is a bit of a gender divide in some places, but they're very, very widely accessed. It doesn't require for everyone in a community to have a phone. It's enough for a handful of people for our approach already to be effective. So on the whole, we're not finding that to be a barrier. But there is one thing that is being put forward as a hope, or two issues actually, that I really want to warn a bit against. So one is blockchain, right? And yeah, we used to talk about it a lot more, and we now it's healthy that we talk about it a bit less. Because yes, the distributed and immutable ledger has definite benefits, but it's all about what happens at the first point of entry, right? What is the quality of data that you get at the very beginning? And garbage in, it's garbage out, right? And so you cannot solve that problem with a blockchain solution alone. The other big hope is artificial intelligence. And you see that in the commercial sector, even more so than in development. But is the use of AI and machine learning, and you referenced it briefly, Alex, as one of the ways of getting around the data problem for corporate reporting. Now, here we have a couple of problems. One is, again, the underlying data in the corporate sector is not being produced at the moment. So what can they scrape with the AI that the companies themselves don't know and aren't producing? But the second problem is, let's just be cautious and realistic about this. AI is very scary, and we've seen the films that threaten and warn us about how it's interfering in our lives. But this summer I was being offered socks on Amazon, winter socks that I had bought the previous winter, right? A friend of mine who bought an expensive bag, 3 weeks later, he was being sold repeatedly the same bag, right? I'm in Israel at the moment. I don't speak a word of Hebrew, or very few. And if I watch YouTube, all the ads are in Hebrew. These are companies with very, very deep pockets, as we know. And they haven't been able to fine-tune their AI to solve those very basic problems. Facial recognition can't recognize Black people, right, by a margin of 5 to 10 times greater than white people. So let's be very careful here about what we promise that AI can do. Ultimately, it's about people making better choices. People being empowered to make better choices, whether it's at the bottom, in the middle, or at the top. Doesn't matter where. It's people who ultimately make the choices. Still, today. we hope it stays like that for a little longer, right? And therefore, the solutions we built have to be empowering of people and not disempowering.
Yeah, I think those are super salient points. We had this discussion a little bit when we prepared, and I think it's an unfair characterization of AI to say that the remarketeers on YouTube are haven't figured out. I think you can imagine. I would have liked to have the CEO of this upright, because I think it's an interesting approach. If you imagine a data where there's a world with this billion of data points, for example, satellites are capturing tons and tons of pictures that are being cross-referenced with supply chain cost, and you're just cutting data left, right, and center, and you start to see patterns about when this truck does this delivery, the CO2 goes a little bit down. Like you can start to see at big scale how some things could be done, but I think probably the jury's still out on whether that's the way to go. But I'm not as dismissive about the technology as you might be. But let me ask you this: you mentioned you said the example of the farmer in Denmark. Like the bottom can be anywhere, or maybe the start of the supply chain can be in a developing country or not. In the context of let's say Arla is the company in Denmark that it's a co-op of all the milk and dairy producers. And they want to measure impact at the bottom, at the source. How does your methodology, TrueFootprint, apply in a context like that? Does it make a difference where you are in the world to how you approach this?
Well, in principle, not, right? The same logic applies anywhere, in effect, and that you want to trust but be able to verify, and you want to make sure that the people are reporting are trustworthy as well. So again, it's not to say that there can't be some self-reporting, but you do have to have mechanisms that really enable us to verify that what we're getting makes some sense. And but otherwise, the logic is the same anywhere, and as demonstrated now, for example, with the work again on COVID, right? I mean, this is a unique situation where we're all having to face the same basic norms. Our resources are not the same, but the basic norms are the same.
Okay, cool. I just want to say, if those of you who have questions, you can type away in the chat window. We are keeping an eye. I've been able to multitask a little bit. Well, I'm actually demonstrating that I can't multitask now because I forgot my next question. Rasmus, I did want to ask, what's your number one problem on impact measurement? So, if you had a magic wand, if there's an entrepreneur listening and saying, go build this for me, what would you like to see that you're not able to build? You can't afford it. You don't have time. Nobody's thought of it. What would you like to see?
I think my main challenge is in the dialogue and the contact with the end user, the beneficiary, the project participants.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about technology as a solution or something that can sort of help us, but we haven't really sort of figured out sort of tools and methods there that that sort of really works across the board. So there's something there in sort of closing, sort of getting sort of a tighter feedback loop that is extremely challenging for us. A different but related example, I think, in these days is that we would like people to know where they can go and complain, for example, about sexual harassment. So we are struggling with it. We're struggling getting out the channels, explaining sort of how they should be used and how the data will be treated. It's difficult also in some contexts to protect the data against government interference. So there is a lot, I think, sort of at the entry point there of the data collection where we struggle. Yeah, so to mention a few, I mean, it would definitely be sort of system solutions that can help smoothen that dialogue and make it both in quantitative terms, but definitely also in qualitative terms. And there would be something also in that sense about data protection and data, sort of the safety around the data that we're gathering.
Okay, so there was a question from Eric van Weert about, and I'll just ask both of you if you have thoughts. So the poll mentioned that 65% of companies do not know what to measure, and he's asking why is that so difficult? Because in listening to you, you sort of maybe know what to measure, we don't know how to get the data. So why is finding out what to measure so difficult? Any clues on that?
Yeah, so maybe it is I mean, it's not that indeed this is a challenge. I want to recognize that, because that distinction between the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact, goes to the what to measure. And it is very confusing for many. Now, if you look at a company that's been on this journey for a long time, like IKEA, you will see that it's outcome, impact measure, outcome. They're very systematic about it. But others are reporting until recently and still nonsense, really, about some of the things that they have done.
Yeah.
So that's on the one hand. But I think ultimately, if I go to answer your question, Alex, it is about how, whether companies really are serious simply to move from greenwashing to real effects. Are they serious about the transition to impact? Because unfortunately, it's too easy to get away with virtue signaling in one form or another. And the impact investing sector has actually not been any better at it, unfortunately, right? So it's not that we can very easily point to the example of a precursor there. And it leaves opportunity for innovation, but unfortunately, we still have a long way to go.
I would concur with those two. I think, I mean, even for me, and I've been sitting with so many project proposals, and I still do get confused. Sort of when I have to explain the project and then I'll write it down or send it to a donor on these different levels and appropriate indicators at these levels. It is confusing, but I think similarly that the whole impact agenda, I guess sort of for the private sector in the corporate sector is fairly new, and I think that there is a certain element for some companies in terms of sort of putting some bold messages and great statements out there, but is it part of the core business? And if it's not, there is sort of an automatic de-link, of course, somewhere between our sort of the intentions that we sort of put out there and what we actually deliver. And that, of course, gives a difficulty in how on earth do we then go about sort of measuring that, because there's not a lot in the outcomes that we actually produce that sort of delivers against that ambition. And then, of course, there is a de-link there somewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. We're just on the hour, 1 minute away. We started 4 minutes late, but we'll finish on time. I want to thank you, Rasmus and Frederick, for your precious time. And good luck with the endeavors. You're both doing unbelievably important things. Wish you all the best going forward. I want to thank my young colleague Jakob, who helped me put this together. And we will be doing another more in-depth webinar and proper webinar with content, because I think as I said, I flew at a 10,000 feet altitude, and I think it's worth digging a little bit more. And as we do innovation projects with big companies like IKEA and others, we also want to be able to answer our own questions. In the real world, how the hell do we do this so that we can measure what we've always measured, which is P&L. You know, this, if you do this project, you'll make more money or save costs, but now add the all-important third element of impact. So thank you all. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.